Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into it. We're unpacking this huge stack of source material you share with us. We've got articles, academic papers, cultural commentary,
A lot to get through.
a lot. And it's all focused on this one single question that I think anyone who watches anime has asked at some point. Why are so many female characters? Well, why are they portrayed as so demure, so soft-spoken, and just profoundly reserved?
It's a critical question, for sure. Because as all the analysis in our sources points out, this isn't a coincidence. It's an aesthetic code.
An aesthetic code, I like that.
Yeah, you could almost call it a kind of beautifully animated compliance. And it really begs the question of whether it's maybe unintentionally legitimizing the very real, very limiting social messages that women often get.
You mean like being told you're too loud?
Exactly. Too loud, too argumentative, or the big one, too emotional to be taken seriously.
That's the exact tension we want to dive into. Because look, most people who watch mainstream anime, they notice this trend, they see it. But it's hard to go from just seeing it to really getting it, to understanding why this repetition matters on a structural level.
Right.
We're not here to just slap a label on it, call it good or bad. We're here to understand the mechanics of it. How is femininity being coded? How is it being rewarded? And in some ways, controlled in these huge commercial stories.
So our mission today is pretty comprehensive. We're going to explore how anime, especially in genres aimed at male audiences, uses this repetition and reward system to build up this compliant ideal.
Okay.
But we're not stopping there. Then we're going to pivot and look at the powerful counter-narratives.
The anime made for and by women.
Exactly. The stories that radically redefine what strength and agency look like. And finally, we'll connect all these portrayals back to the broader structural and cultural gender issues, not just in Japan, but globally.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this enormous topic and see how this aesthetic of compliance really functions in, I guess, the biggest slice of the anime pie.
Get into it.
So when we're talking about the most common examples of this demure ideal, we're almost always talking about mainstream, globally popular anime. And we have to start with the market context.
Always.
That means shonen for young men and seinen for adult men. Our sources are really clear on this. These genres are fundamentally designed around male fantasy and, I think this is the key part, male identification. So what does that commercial need immediately tell us about the roles women are going to have?
It tells us that female characters, really by necessity of the story structure, are often going to be structurally ancillary.
Ancillary.
Yeah, the main narrative consequence is that they exist specifically in relation to a male protagonist. They're not the engine of their own story, their own sovereign arc. Their support systems, their emotional anchors, their motivations, or, frankly, their visual rewards.
Their whole purpose is relational.
Their purpose is relational, exactly.
So can you give us a concrete example? Like, what does that relational role actually look like on screen?
Okay, sure. Think about a classic battle anime. The female character, she might be the healer, or the one with the unrequited crush on the hero, or the moral compass who's, waiting back at home.
Right.
And even if she's super skilled herself, her big moments of agency often just serve to protect or support the male lead, not to advance her own separate goal.
So she might, sacrifice her own mission to give him a piece of intel or something?
Precisely. Or to give him that emotional boost when he's about to give up. She's a passive endpoint or a stabilizing force. But she's rarely the one driving the main conflict forward because of her own ambition.
And inside that framework, you see these very specific behaviors being rewarded over and over again. It's like a really clear system of narrative incentives.
Oh, absolutely. The traits that get a big thumbs up, narratively speaking, in these male-centric stories are, well, their gentleness, deep patience, and I think most importantly, emotional labor.
Emotional.
The demure ideal is the woman who just gets the protagonist. She understands his inner turmoil without him even having to say anything. And that kind of unearned, intuitive validation, that's a powerful fantasy.
Because in the real world, emotional labor is exhausting. And it's rarely a one-way street.
Exactly. And the narrative rewards this behavior with security, with affection, and usually with winning the hero's heart in the end.
So on the flip side of that, the cost of assertiveness is also incredibly clear. If gentleness is the good currency, what happens when a female character tries to spend the currency of, say, confrontation or dominance?
Well, the narrative has to work really hard to neutralize it. The second a woman gets too loud, too opinionated, or too dominant, the story has to do one of three things.
Okay.
It either punishes her, she gets isolated, or she fails, or it softens her. It shows she's actually really vulnerable under that tough exterior.
Or, and this is the big one, it reframes her assertiveness as comedy.
That's the comedic reframing, and the Sunder trope is, it's a huge source of both conflict and popularity.
For sure.
It's the ultimate containment strategy, really. The Sunder, this character who's initially sharp or aggressive before, revealing a softer, more compliant side. She's basically asserting her independence only to have that independence filed down.
So the aggression is only okay because it's funny.
It's made palatable because it's followed by her being humiliated or blushing or the comedy of her being all conflicted. And it always, always leads back to compliance and affection for the male lead. The narrative makes sure those assertive edges are temporary or contained or just a joke. They never truly challenge the male centrality of the story.
Okay, so let's define the archetype itself now that we get its function. The sources call this the demure ideal. What are the specific visual and behavioral traits that kind of define her across all these different shows?
The traits are instantly recognizable, I think. She's coded as soft-spoken, often with a voice that's a bit higher-pitched than is natural. She's perpetually emotionally restrained, loyal to a fault, deeply patient, and self-sacrificing.
And a crucial marker is that she's not confrontational.
Never. She is the quiet center of the storm. Her body language is often kind of inward or gentle. She rarely takes up a lot of physical space, and her reactions always prioritize everyone else's feelings over her own. She's structurally an emotional refuge from all the conflict in the plot.
And this isn't just something animators cooked up out of nowhere, is it? The sources trace this ideal back to these really powerful, long-standing cultural roots. I saw this phrase in the notes, Yamato Nadeshiko. How does that specific cultural idea translate into the visual shorthand we see in anime?
Right, Yamato Nadeshiko. It literally translates to Japanese fringe flower, a flower that's seen as delicate, beautiful, but also resilient. It's the traditional vision of the ideal woman.
Yeah.
Elegant, quiet, profoundly supportive, and morally pure.
Okay.
Now, like any national ideal, think of the Victorian angel in the house in the West. It was always more of an expectation than a reality for most women, but it still profoundly shaped social norms for a very long time.
So it sounds like the anime industry is taking this kind of lofty, sometimes repressive historical ideal and just packaging it for modern consumption.
That's a great way to put it. Anime stylizes and distills this historical ideal into a visual shorthand. By drawing on Yamato Nadeshiko, the demure ideal character becomes instantly legible to the audience as, the good one.
The safe choice.
The safe choice, or the woman who will uphold tradition. This character is meant to be the moral clarity in all the chaos of the story. She's an anchor for the male protagonist's development, but her main job is never to rock the boat. It's to maintain the emotional equilibrium.
So her function in the narrative is profoundly conservative, then no matter how wild or fantastical the plot is, she's the emotional stabilizer.
She is the keeper of the protagonist's virtue, and often she's his safe harbor. She's the woman who waits patiently for him to come back from his quest.
Not the one who decides to go on a quest of her own.
Exactly. Her primary job in the story is to be an available, non-judgmental source of comfort. And this reinforces that fantasy that emotional safety and deep loyalty should be these non-demanding, one-way female traits.
And this emphasis on being small, on being quiet, on emotional restraint. That leads us right to the sharpest point of feminist critique, that really troubling overlap between how compliance and sexualization are framed in these genres. How do they get fused together?
This is what draws the most consistent and, I think, valid critique. This fusion is framed by a few key aesthetic choices. You see youthful bodies, often exaggeratedly high-pitched voices, gestures of naivety, and this sense of emotional dependence.
It creates a power imbalance, visually and orally.
A significant one. And the underlying message is that desirability, especially for a long-term loyal partner, isn't tied to her agency or her intellect or having mutual power. It's tied to smallness, silence, and compliance.
So the subtext is less, this character is cute, and more. This character is desirable because she lacks power, and so she's not a threat or a challenge to the protagonist.
Precisely. The visual and narrative framing, maybe unintentionally, reinforces this idea that compliance equals reward. The fantasy character is written to be eternally non-demanding and endlessly patient. It creates this low-risk, high-reward emotional environment for the male lead.
which is why the sources call this whole system aesthetic reinforcement.
Exactly.
I want to stick with that phrase for a second, aesthetic reinforcement, because that's where the fiction starts to leak into reality for the viewer. How does seeing this reward structure play out over and over again affect female viewers who are also navigating real-world gender expectations?
Well, for women viewers, especially young women who are already hearing social messages that their natural assertiveness or their emotions are too much, these stories can subtly legitimize those negative social pressures.
It makes it feel normal.
It does. The media models a reward structure. Quiet women are the ones who get chosen. They find romantic success. They're beloved by the hero. Assertive women, on the other hand, are often isolated, or they're framed as comedic distractions, or they even get cast as minor villains.
So if you're a young woman figuring out how to present yourself, the media is providing this powerful, emotionally sticky template that suggests the path of least resistance and highest reward is to kind of shrink yourself, lower your voice, and minimize your own needs.
Absolutely. Think about anger. When a woman expresses anger in these narratives, it's routinely pathologized. It's seen as unattractive or irrational or a sign of some deep emotional brokenness that the male hero needs to fix.
Whereas male anger is often the engine of the plot, righteous fury that leads to victory.
Exactly. So anime doesn't invent these societal gender expectations, but it stylizes them and normalizes them in a really captivating way. It sets a profoundly narrow lane for what's considered acceptable, successful femininity. The psychological effect is this constant, subtle comparison between the ideal, which is compliant, and your reality, which is complex and demanding.
But the moment we suggest that the demure ideal is the only thing anime offers, we're ignoring decades of really complex, groundbreaking, and often revolutionary work. We have to bring in the powerful counterexamples to keep this deep dive honest.
This is vital. To analyze anime fairly, you have to resist the urge to treat it like one single monolithic thing. And we have powerful mass-market examples that actively challenge or just plain ignore the compliant ideal. I mean, consider Sailor Moon.
Sailor Moon is a fantastic point of contrast. I mean, these characters are emotional, they cry, they're super expressive and very overtly feminine, but their emotionality is the source of their strength, not some weakness they need to suppress.
Precisely. Their heroism comes from their feelings, from their intense capacity for empathy, and their ability to build these powerful community bonds. Their power fantasy isn't about quiet restraint. It's about loud emotional collaboration. They are the antithesis of the restrained demure ideal.
And then, on a completely different psychological wavelength, you have the women of Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Oh, yes.
They're abrasive, they're broken, sexual, dominant, and deeply contradictory. They're definitely not safe or patient or emotionally legible.
Evangelion gives us women who are actively selfish, demanding, and even psychologically abusive. And that is the core of their character. They're often profoundly unlikable, but they're also deeply human, and they drive the action through their own brokenness and ambition. They refuse to be emotional prosthetics.
Right.
Major Kusanagi from Ghost in the Shell is another great one. Her body might be highly sexualized by the camera, but her mind and her agency are entirely sovereign. It's all about action and intellect, not relational support.
And I think we have to mention the series Nana, which functions almost like a documentary of messy adult female relationships. It just utterly refuses to smooth out the edges of his protagonists.
Nana is maybe the strongest counterexample to the demure ideal's insistence on purity and self-sacrifice. You have women who are loud, messy, selfish, loving, ambitious, and destructive, and they are never asked to be fixed or tamed for the audience's comfort.
Their complexity is their strength.
And that refusal to moralize or smooth out their flaws is what makes it a profoundly radical text.
That last point about the structural refusal to tame or fix the characters, that leads us directly into the next section. Because the real counterforce to the demure ideal isn't just a few rogue characters in shonen, it's an entirely separate industrial structure, right?
Exactly. When you change the target audience, the entire moral and narrative logic shifts with it.
It's so easy for Western audiences to just focus on what's topping the global streaming charts, which are, let's be honest, usually shonen titles. But our sources remind us that women aren't just a growing part of the audience. They are foundational pillars of the whole manga and anime ecosystem. So let's clearly define the core demographics that are aimed specifically at women.
We need to acknowledge the two core demographics which often get mistakenly lumped together. First, you have shōjo, that's anime and manga for girls and young women. It often focuses on intense emotional life, coming-of-age stories, and dramatic fantasy.
And the second one?
The second is josei. This is targeted specifically at adult women. It generally deals with more realistic, complex relationships, career issues, and just the everyday emotional messiness of adult life.
And we should be clear, these are not niche markets.
Oh, far from it. They're foundational to the industry's history, and right now they drive these massive, highly engaged fandoms, especially in areas like high-stakes romance, detailed fantasy worlds, and genres like BL or boys' love.
Right.
Women are the primary creators, readers, critics, fan fiction writers, and cosplayers in these spaces. They are subjects, not objects.
So when you look at the source material that's being made by and for this huge audience, what's the fundamental difference in the storytelling approach compared to the male-targeted genres?
The focus just test. It changes completely. In female-centered works, the story emphasizes how it feels to live, love, and choose from the protagonist's internal perspective.
All about the interiority.
Yes. The narrative mechanism isn't about external conquest or who the audience finds desirable. The plot is about navigating your inner emotional life, understanding complex relationships, which are often platonic or familial, and demonstrating power within constraints, which, reflect the actual reality of navigating structural limits as women.
Let's talk more about that power shift. How does reversing the male gaze actually show up in these stories?
The gaze shifts from evaluation, is this woman compliant enough to be a good partner, to empathy. What is this woman experiencing and what choices is she making?
And the goal shifts from conquest to personal growth.
Exactly. The central themes become interiority, reflection, and self-definition. Even in a romance story, the focus is on the emotional journey of the female lead, her evolving maturity, her changing needs, rather than just on, getting the guy at the end.
There's this common Western misconception, I think, that if media is feminist or female-centered, it has to reject all things aesthetic. Like the women can't be beautiful or care about romance. Do shōjo and josei reject beauty?
Not at all. But they reframe it entirely. These shows are often gorgeously stylized, they feature incredibly beautiful women and men, and they often idealize romance. But the key difference is who the beauty is for.
Why?
Softness, elegance, booty. They're all decoupled from obedience. In male-targeted anime, softness is a virtue that makes a woman a safe, supportive reward. In female-targeted anime, softness or beauty is just one component of the protagonist's identity. It doesn't erase her agency. She is always the emotional subject, constantly defining her own terms.
So it's the narrative logic that truly separates them. In shonen, silence is rewarded, but in shōjo and josei stories, passivity often becomes the main obstacle the protagonist has to overcome.
That's the crucial inflection point. Passivity, especially in shōjo anime, is framed as a problem. It's something that leads to unhappiness or stagnation or making bad choices. The emotional conflict often centers on the protagonist learning to voice her needs, assert her boundaries, or prioritize herself.
I can see why that would be resonant.
Josei, in particular, is targeting adult women who already understand the cost of silence in their careers and relationships. It makes the narratives incredibly powerful.
The josei genre really allows for an adult complexity that just isn't permitted in that purity-focused demure ideal. Women are allowed to be selfish, to make huge mistakes, and to prioritize their careers without being automatically turned into villains.
And that allowance for moral complexity is vital. In josei, women can be genuinely selfish. They can make bad romantic decisions, they can choose their career over family for a while, or express deep, irrational anger without being immediately put in a box as an antagonist who needs to be tamed.
Their flaws are part of their humanity.
Exactly. They're central to their humanity, not just something for the male hero to correct.
Let's focus on the case study that really embodies this complexity, Nana. This series, focused on two women, is maybe the definitive example of celebrating assertive yet profoundly flawed women.
Oh, Nana is remarkable, precisely because it refuses that likable woman mandate. The entire series is about Nana Osaki and Nana Komatsu, two young women chasing dramatically different kinds of fulfillment. One wants to be a rock star, the other wants a traditional romance.
Right.
And they are constantly emotional, often jealous, sometimes manipulative, ambitious to the point of cruelty, and profoundly destructive. Not just to each other, but to themselves.
But you never asked to judge them or fix them.
Their
messiness is the story.
Exactly. The narrative gives them the space to be fully human. Take Nana Osaki's fierce ambition. She's single-minded, sometimes cold, and willing to sacrifice conventional happiness for her career. In a shunting context, that ambition would probably be pathologized as something that's isolating her from true romance.
But in
Nana, it's framed as a valid, albeit painful, choice. Similarly, the other Nana, Hachi, is depicted as emotionally dependent. She prioritizes men. She often makes poor romantic choices. But the series doesn't scold her. It explores the cost of that dependency. It refuses the idea that a woman must be morally pure or likable to deserve the audience's attention. Their contradictions are the truth of the story.
So when we talk about strength in shōjo and josei, it clearly goes way beyond just physical fighting. How do we define that profound internal strength, and how do our examples illustrate it?
Strength here means strength through choice, through endurance, refusal, growth, self-definition, and, critically, emotional honesty. The woman's internal emotional life isn't just decoration. It is the engine of the plot, which is a radical reversal of the demure ideal, whose internal life only exists to serve the male lead's needs.
Let's look at the quiet radicalism of Fruits Basket. On the surface, the main character, Toru Honda, seems like the demure ideal. She's gentle, she's kind, self-sacrificing. So how is her gentleness reframed as resilience rather than submission?
The brilliance of Fruits Basket is in how it defines kindness. Toru's compassion isn't passive. It's an active, assertive choice she makes every single day. A choice to use empathy over retreat, even when she's facing deep emotional trauma from the cursed Soma family.
So she's demonstrating emotional labor, but without erasing herself.
Exactly. Her kindness has boundaries. She chooses to heal others by first asserting her own moral framework, not by just submitting to their pain or their demands. She's resilient because she holds on to her selfhood while giving care. If she were just submissive, the story wouldn't work. She heals them because her choice of kindness forces them to confront their own trauma through her lens.
That distinction, kindness as an active verb, not a passive state, is so crucial. Okay, now let's look at a different kind of strength. The raw ambition in Chihaya Furu.
Chihaya Furu is such a fascinating exception to the rule. It's a sports anime centered entirely around a female protagonist's ambition. Chihaya isn't chasing a boy. She is chasing mastery of the traditional card game, Karuta.
And she's the opposite of the demure ideal.
Completely. She's loud, she's strange, obsessed, and often oblivious to social niceties. Her competitive drive and her single-minded focus are celebrated as virtues. The narrative doesn't soften her ambition for male comfort or prioritize her romance over her competitive goals. Her failures and her persistence in the world of competitive sport, traditionally male territory, that's the central focus. Her goal is sovereign.
And finally, revolutionary girl Utena, which is on a whole other level. It's deeper, it's symbolic. It's basically dismantling the whole fairy tale structure itself.
Oh, Utena is a profound text. It deconstructs the entire institution of traditional gender roles and that whole prince saves the princess's trope. Utena is a heroine who decides to become a prince rather than be rescued by one.
Her strength is in her refusal of predefined femininity.
Yes, she fights not for a man, but for the agency of another woman, Anthe, and most importantly, for her own right to self-authorship. By the end, she rejects both the predefined roles, the beautiful damsel and the heroic savior, and chooses instead to define her own existence. It's strength as a philosophical and political refusal.
So we've established that changing the audience completely changes the DNA of the story. If we had to synthesize the fundamental difference in the moral logic between these two types of genres, how would you frame it?
I think we can boil down the entire narrative divergence to two distinct questions that drive the plot. Male-targeted anime often implicitly asks, is this woman desirable, supportive, or comforting enough to aid the protagonist and stabilize the narrative?
And female-targeted anime asks.
It asks a far more complex, protagonist-centered question. What does this woman fundamentally want, and what is the emotional, professional, and social cost of pursuing that desire honestly?
And that single shift changes everything. The conflict, the dialogue, the resolution, what the story validates. It shows that female-targeted anime doesn't necessarily reject softness or romance, but it performs this vital social operation.
Which is?
It decouples those traits from silence and submission. It advocates for women to be honest about their desires, even when that honesty is costly or disrupts the existing social or romantic order.
That's the core of it.
So we've established the demure ideal is prevalent, but now we have to connect that aesthetic to the soil it grew from. Is the anime girl just some random fictional construct, Or is it an exaggerated mirror of cultural and structural ideals in Japan?
It's both. It's an exaggeration and a profound reflection. I mean, the demure ideal is clearly a fictional construct, stylized for maximum commercial appeal, but its foundation rests on real, long-standing cultural frameworks in Japan that place an extremely high value on reserved, emotionally contained, and supportive traits, especially for women.
So the medium didn't invent the expectation of Yamato Nadeshiko.
It just amplified and digitized it.
And this connects directly to the Japanese concept of harmony culture, or wa. How does that societal value of harmony translate into gendered behavior?
Japan places an incredibly high cultural value on social harmony, wa, and indirect communication. It favors avoiding public confrontation or emotional outbursts. Now, while everyone is expected to adhere to this, our sources show that women face disproportionately harsher social penalties for violating those norms.
Like public anger or being too assertive?
Exactly. Direct assertion of need, competitive ambition. These are punished more harshly. The compliant anime girl, therefore, is the perfect aesthetic representation of wa. She's non-confrontational, she maintains stability. Anime often encodes this by rewarding her quiet endurance or by turning any assertive female character into a comedic or pathological outlier to contain her disruptive potential.
And then there's that perplexing paradox of sexuality. How can Japan have this reputation for public conservatism and rigid gender norms, but at the same time tolerate, even celebrate, these highly explicit private fantasy spaces in anime, manga, and gaming?
It's a classic sociological displacement mechanism because public modesty, indirectness, and conformity are so highly valued. The emotional and sexual desires that can't be expressed socially get displaced into these highly formalized media spaces.
So anime and manga act as pressure valves.
Crucial pressure valves. And this displacement results in that fusion we talked about earlier. The highly sexualized fantasy woman often retains the veneer of cultural restraint and compliance. She is the embodiment of desire, but without the social demands of a real woman. It's less about directly controlling real women and more about accommodating male fantasy under severe, self-imposed social constraint.
Culture is sticky, but we have to connect the media trope to the cold, hard data of structural reality. If the media is presenting this image of supportive stability, does this reflect true gender parity in modern Japan?
Tragically, no. Despite being a highly educated, wealthy society, Japan struggles with deep structural challenges when it comes to gender equality. Our sources point to a persistent and significant wage gap. Critically, in 2025, the World Economic Forum ranks Japan 118th globally on the Global Gender Gap Index.
118th. That isn't just a slight lag. That signals profound systemic issues.
It does.
What are the specific structural challenges that keep that ranking so low? It can't just be low pay.
No, it's multifaceted. A primary factor is what's called the M-curve employment pattern. Women typically drop out of the workforce after childbirth and then struggle to re-enter, often landing in lower-wage, non-regular employment tracks.
Which reinforces that media trope that women are just temporary participants in public life.
Exactly. Furthermore, Japan's extreme work hours culture, or zangi, creates a system where long, non-negotiable hours are rewarded. This makes it physically impossible for men to share domestic labor, so it forces women to shoulder a disproportionate domestic burden, which inevitably impacts their career trajectory and limits their representation in leadership.
So the structural reality, the lack of affordable care, the expectation of long work hours, it reinforces the media tropes that cast women as the primary emotional caretakers. It's a closed loop.
It absolutely is. The media becomes the myth-making machine that justifies the existing institutional inequalities. If women are structurally penalized for career ambition and rewarded for domestic labor, the media follows suit by casting assertive women as abrasive and domestic women as ideals. The compliant anime character is a beautiful fictional solution to a profound social problem. Who is going to provide the care and stability needed when the economic structure demands brutal working hours from men? The fantasy just outsources the problem.
So we've seen the structural gap in Japan. Let's zoom out to the global stage and look at countries that are succeeding in gender equality. Where are they finding success, and what are the policy levers that actively dismantle these structural inequalities?
Well, we consistently see the Nordic countries, Iceland, Norway, Finland leading the charge. Iceland, for instance, has been ranked #1 on the WEEF Global Gender Gap Report for years, along with New Zealand. Their success is critical because it shows that parity is not an accident of culture. It is an outcome of intentional policy.
What are the concrete policies that separate Iceland from Japan in this regard?
Their success is driven by comprehensive policy and strong norms. The first major lever is care infrastructure. They offer highly subsidized, accessible childcare from infancy onward. This fundamentally disrupts the assumption that women are the default primary caregivers. Secondly, they implement mandatory parental leave for both parents. And it's often structured as use it or lose it leave for fathers, which forces men to participate in caregiving and normalizes their presence at home. This helps break that Zhangdu cycle.
So the state actively intervenes to make sure domestic labor is shared, which then frees up women to pursue careers on equal footing.
Yeah.
What are the other drivers?
The third lever is political representation. Many of these high-parity countries use gender quotas or other mechanisms to ensure women have a significant voice in parliament. This matters immensely because political representation is what passes and funds the equality policies, like childcare and parental leave, that dismantle the structural barriers.
And the fourth?
The fourth is strong anti-discrimination law and enforcement, making sure the wage gap is tracked and penalized.
It's fascinating how clearly the sources define these structural drivers. While media matters because it normalizes authority, the biggest levers of equality are these hard structures.
That is the essential takeaway. The main sources of gender equality are structural: law, care infrastructure, an economic structure that avoids the extreme Zhangyi problem, and political representation. Anime, by contrast, is part of the cultural reinforcement system. It teaches the expectations emotionally, but it isn't the root cause of the inequality. If the structures change, the media narratives eventually have to follow.
Okay, let's turn now to how we, as dedicated, informed viewers, engage with this complex medium. When we hear that common critical shorthand anime girls, it often collapses so many complex facets into a single, easily dismissed stereotype. We need to unpack that compression.
You're right. The criticism typically lands on a narrow, highly visible subset, the young, cute, and sexualized characters you see in Shinshin and Seinen. But the term anime girl is a generalization that just erases massive diversity. It collapses age, genre, character function, and audience into one distorted image. We have to be specific about which anime girl we're criticizing.
And there's a vital cultural nuance we often miss, which is the function of kawaii, or cuteness. Western audiences often interpret high-pitched voices and softness as infantilization. How does kawaii function differently in Japanese cultural logic?
It's a subtle but crucial distinction. While Western critiques often default to seeing kawaii as infantilization in Japanese cultural logic, it also functions as social disarmament, as emotional accessibility.
Social disarmament.
Yeah. A high-pitched voice can signal vulnerability, and thus non-aggression, making the character seem non-threatening and easy to approach. The problem, the moment the critique sharpens, is when that cuteness is fused with sexual availability and a profound lack of agency. A cute woman isn't automatically weak culturally, but if she is cute, sexually available, and non-autonomous, that's where the aesthetic reinforcement becomes really problematic.
This leads us to this under-discussed, deeply insightful concept our sources flagged: the function of many of these characters as emotional prosthetics. I find that term incredibly illuminating.
It is perhaps the single most important concept in understanding the popularity of the demure ideal. In male-targeted anime, these characters exist not for their own story, but to perform essential emotional labor for the male protagonist. They soothe his loneliness, they validate his existence, they reward his endurance, and they offer unconditional emotional safety.
They're written to be endlessly patient, emotionally legible, and most critically non-demanding.
Exactly. So the harm isn't just the portrayal of women, but the expectation it models for male emotional life.
Right.
The fantasy outsources the protagonist's entire social and emotional support system. The character exists primarily to regulate male emotion without having significant, messy, or contradictory needs of her own. She's the perfect non-threatening companion. And this ties directly back to Japan's socio-demographic crisis loneliness, declining marriage rates, high societal stress.
The character functions as a buffer against male alienation. It fills a void of low-risk, emotionally safe companionship that's increasingly hard to find in a demanding, stressful society.
Yes. The popularity of these non-demanding characters shifts the critical question from why are women portrayed this way to a more empathic one: what deep social and emotional needs are being met by this fantasy relationship, which is structured entirely without rejection or confrontation. It reveals this deep yearning for unconditional care that is being commodified and outsourced into fiction.
Let's address the direct question of media harm. Does the presence of sexual themes, nudity, or suggestive clothing in anime automatically make it harmful media?
Our sources suggest that the mere presence of those elements is not the determining factor. The harm is determined by framing.
Claiming.
Does the character retain agency while being viewed? Does the camera just focus on her body as the whole point of the scene, or is it contextualized by her action and her intellect? A show can have nudity and still be non-exploitative if the character keeps her interiority. And conversely, a show can be deeply harmful without any nudity if it repeatedly frames women as objects or rewards, or if it normalizes coercion as acceptable romantic behavior. Framing dictates the psychological impact.
And when we talk about long-term psychological impact, we have to bring in cultivation theory. It explains how repeated exposure to media shapes our perception of reality. How does this apply to gender roles in anime?
Cultivation theory basically says that repeated, long-term exposure to media portrayals nudges what people think is normal, competent, and disposable. Media is essentially a myth-making machine that justifies existing institutional inequalities.
So applied to anime.
If a viewer consumes hundreds of hours of shounen, where only quiet women succeed in romance and only men are the primary drivers of the plot, this cultivates two perceptions. First, that assertive women are abnormal or pathological, and second, that men are the only appropriate subjects for sovereign, world-changing ambition.
It normalizes the power dynamic.
Precisely. It narrows the viewer's expectation of what are acceptable social roles. It's not that one episode of one show is harmful, but the sheer volume and repetition of the trope across the entire dominant genre. That's what subtly shifts the baseline of what feels right.
But maybe the most subtle yet powerful long-term effect isn't even bad portrayal, but the profound absence of certain kinds of women.
That is the ultimate critique of structural limitation. The issue is narrowing the bandwidth of femininity. We need to ask what kinds of women are just fundamentally missing from mainstream anime narratives.
Right.
We rarely see older women who have interior lives that aren't just centered on their children or grandchildren. We lack complex, unattractive, but central women. Where are the disabled women who are protagonists? Where are the women over 40 who retain their sexual agency and professional ambition? Anime limits the range of what femininity is allowed to be, and that absence tells a structural story just as loud as the presence of the demure ideal.
Given all this complexity, how can we, the dedicated audience, engage with this medium in a way that respects its artistic merit while staying critically aware of its tropes?
Healthy engagement starts with genre literacy and cognitive separation. You have to treat anime as symbolic fantasy and cultural expression, not as a template or an instruction manual for real-world gender roles or relationships. Recognizing when you're watching a male-targeted fantasy versus a josei emotional realism, that's the first protective step.
I think the idea of critical affection is crucial here, loving the art while critiquing the architecture.
Critical affection is essential for any thoughtful media consumer. It's the ability to love a piece of media deeply, to enjoy its characters, its art, its emotional comfort, while at the same time acknowledging and critiquing its limiting or harmful tropes.
So you can say, I love this character's journey, and I recognize that the trope she embodies serves to limit the portrayal of women broadly.
Exactly. That dual awareness is protective because it stops the emotional comfort the show provides from validating problematic social messages in reality.
What are the warning signs, the red flags, that might indicate a person is internalizing these norms in an unhealthy way?
The red flags really center on rigidity, avoidance, and dehumanization. Unhealthy engagement often shows up as replacement intimacy, where the non-demanding nature of the fictional companion replaces or actively undermines the pursuit of real, complex human relationships.
Okay.
Another flag is the unexamined internalization of norms. That means the viewer starts believing that real women should be quieter or more accommodating or less demanding because their favorite anime characters are. And the ultimate red flag is defensiveness or aggression, when any criticism of the medium is met with hostility because the fiction has become a personal, non-negotiable reality.
So to give our listener a simple, non-judgmental self-check before we wrap up.
A simple question to ask yourself when engaging with any media, especially genre fiction, is, what emotional need is this show filling for me? And critically, does this fantasy shape or distort how I see and treat real people? If the answer to that second question is yes, that internalization is worth examining through a critical lens.
We've taken a comprehensive look, spanning market demands, cultural ideals, economic realities, and critical theory. I think it's time for the final synthesis.
We began by observing this undeniable pattern of demure compliance in popular anime. Our deep dive concludes that anime is a highly stylized commercial mirror of human desire operating under immense cultural and structural constraint. The demure ideal is born from industrial efficiency, the deep legacy of Yamato Nadeshiko, and a profound, perhaps painful need to buffer male alienation from a society that demands too much.
Right.
The danger isn't in the fantasy itself, but it's when fantasy becomes expectation, when emotional comfort becomes social avoidance, and when a convenient archetype becomes a rigid rule for real-world behavior.
And what we found in that distinction between shonen and josei is the space for agreement between anime lovers and serious cultural critics. The goal is never to erase gentle women or cute girls from fiction. The issue is limited range, not softness itself. We need more kinds of women, more ages, more temperaments, more complex internal lives, and more plots where a woman's ambition is the sovereign focus. The aesthetic of compliance is only a problem because it dominates the conversation.
Indeed. The core pursuit is always range, complexity, and honesty about the costs of pursuing one's desires.
So we shouldn't end with the simple question, is anime sexist? But with a final, more provocative thought that builds on that idea of critical affection.
The real pursuit is to understand that loving something deeply is often what makes most honest, resonant critique possible. The most mature position we can take as consumers of this profound global medium is to enjoy the fantasy with gusto, while simultaneously choosing reality with curiosity, humility, and the recognition that the characters we celebrate are a reflection of the profound social questions we still haven't answered in our own society.